Not long ago, I was scrolling through a forum frequented by the America First crowd, the kind of place where users usually spend their time railing against forever wars and demanding the US pullback from every corner of the globe. But that day, the tone had shifted. One user had posted a grainy, low-quality video of a burning village in Nigeria. The caption wasn't about geopolitical instability or climate-driven resource scarcity. It simply read, "They are hunting our brothers. When will we stop the jihad?" The comment section was a fever dream of contradictions. Men who usually post about globalist traps and bringing the boys home were suddenly calling for drone strikes and security missions. One guy, whose profile was covered in anti-interventionist slogans, wrote with a chilling, quiet intensity, "We can't let the cross fall in Africa. If we don't hit them there, we'll be fighting them on our own streets next." He wasn't talking about economics or lithium deposits. He was talking about a holy war. He seemed genuinely convinced that the fate of Western civilization was being decided in the scrublands of the Sahel. But here is where the story gets strange. Just a few threads down, the same people were cheering for a new trade policy that would secure strategic minerals from that exact same region, minerals required for the very green tech they usually claim to despise. It was a jarring, instantaneous pivot. On one hand, a righteous, almost medieval fury about protecting Christians and stopping Islamic expansion. On the other, a cold, calculated interest in cobalt and trade routes. It left me wondering how a movement built on isolationism had suddenly found a backdoor back into global interventionism. The logic of "it's not our fight" had vanished the moment the conflict was rebranded as a religious crusade. It makes you realize that the excitement over saving souls in Sudan or Nigeria might just be the moral camouflage for a much older, much grittier scramble for power. Why has the American right, fractured as it is, suddenly decided that Africa is the only place on Earth worth the risk of a new war?
That's the question, isn't it? It's this incredible paradox that you laid out. It just, it exposes this raw nerve in modern geopolitics.
It felt like watching a sleight of hand trick, Look at this hand, the one holding the cross, and the righteous anger. And don't pay any attention to the other hand that's quietly signing a mining lease for lithium.
Well, and I think we have to be a little careful not to just dismiss it as a cynical trick. Because for the people in that forum, that feeling is, I think, completely genuine. The fear, the sense of civilizational struggle, that's real to them.
Absolutely. I don't doubt the sincerity of the emotion, but that's what makes it such a powerful tool, right? The genuineness of the emotion is what allows it to be weaponized.
It's the perfect cover because it aligns so conveniently with a much colder, much more calculated geopolitical reality. I mean, what you're describing is the opening salvo in what everyone is now calling the new scramble for Africa.
And we should probably define that term. I think people hear "scramble for Africa" and they picture, men in pith helmets in the 19th century drawing lines on a map in Berlin.
Right, the Berlin Conference of 1884. But this is different. It's not about planting flags and claiming territory in the old colonial sense. This scramble is fought with narratives. It's fought with ideologies, with private military contractors, with social media posts, and with infrastructure loans. It's a much more subtle and maybe more insidious kind of competition.
And that's really the mission for this deep dive today. We're not just going to give you a list of critical minerals and who's mining them, though we do need to get into the specifics. What we really want to do is peel back the layers of how these stories, these narratives you're talking about, are being used as a form of geopolitical leverage.
It's all about the tension, isn't it? The tension between the hard physical reality of digging stuff out of the ground, cobalt, lithium, copper, the actual building blocks of the 21st century economy, and these ideological storms that are being imported mostly from the West and projected onto the continent.
And the stakes, they couldn't be higher. We're looking at this perfect storm, this convergence of critical minerals, climate change, and these new kinds of security deals. Africa is the chessboard, no doubt about it, and the pieces are moving incredibly fast.
But I want to be really clear about something right from the start. This isn't just a story about, greedy Western corporations or the evil Chinese state. It's more complicated. It's really about how we in the West project our own internal chaos, our own culture wars onto these regions. We end up using them as a stage.
A stage for our own psychodrama.
Whether it's a drama about religious salvation or a drama about progressive identity, the stage is the same.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we have to move from the abstract 30,000-foot view of geopolitics and get down to the ground. I want to start with a story, a specific person. I was looking at a report recently about a man named Musa.
Right. This is the mine foreman you mentioned.
Exactly. He's a foreman at a cobalt extraction site. And, when we say cobalt extraction site, I think people might picture a highly automated, clean, high-tech facility. That is not what this is. This is a region where the dust itself is the color of rust and gold. It's manual, it's gritty, and it can be incredibly dangerous.
And for a guy like Musa, the term social stability, that's not an abstract concept from a think tank paper.
For him, it's the simple, brutal fact of his workers being able to show up for their shift without being shaken down or worse at a militia roadblock. It's about whether the different ethnic groups on his crew can work together without suspicion. That's stability.
And that's the kind of stability that's built from the ground up, right? It's not imposed.
The report said he spent years, a decade almost, building this delicate peace between two local clans just to keep the mine and, by extension, the entire local economy breathing. He's basically a community organizer, a diplomat in a hard hat. But the footage I saw of him, his face just darkens when he starts talking about these new advisors who've shown up from overseas.
And let's be clear, these aren't engineers.
No. They weren't there to fix the power grid or help with water purification or improve safety standards in the mine. They were there, in his words, to tell his workers that their neighbors, the ones from the other clan they'd been working with for years, were their eternal spiritual enemies.
So they're taking a local rivalry, which might have been about land or grazing rights for generations.
And they're pouring this high-octane ideological fuel onto it. They're using a persecuted minority narrative to justify bringing in their own private security forces, which, of course, they control.
This is where it gets so incredibly messy. You take a manageable local conflict and you relabel it. You rebrand it as part of a global, existential, religious war. And once you do that, compromise becomes impossible. How do you compromise in a holy war?
You can't. And that's what Musa saw happening right in front of him. He described watching this organic trust, this social fabric he'd spent a decade weaving together, just dissolve in a matter of weeks, replaced by this thick, ugly tension that serves a foreign political campaign. It looks great in a fundraising email back in Washington or on a cable news segment, but on the ground, it threatens to choke the very supply chain his village depends on to eat.
It's a brutal irony, isn't it?
It's devastating. In the name of protecting a specific group through this ideological labeling, we end up destroying the very functional governance that actually keeps everyone safe and fed.
I think we need to pause on that term you use, functional governance. It sounds so dry, so academic. But in the context of the global economy we're building, it is absolutely everything. Musa's nightmare isn't just some local tragedy in a place most people can't find on a map. It's a flashing red light for the entire global supply chain.
Let's zoom out then. Let's connect Musa's backyard to the global picture. We've been looking at the Africa Governance Report, and the statistics on resource concentration are they're mind-boggling.
Let's start with the big one, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. When we talk about cobalt, we're talking about the DRC. Any idea how much of the world's supply comes from just that one country?
I've seen figures, I think, around 60 or 70%.
Over 70% now. And it's climbing. Now, let's explain for a second why that single number is so important. Cobalt is the stabilizer. It's the critical element in the cathode of pretty much every lithium-ion battery on the planet.
So the battery in your phone, your laptop, and most importantly, the battery in an electric vehicle.
Exactly. Cobalt is what keeps that battery from overheating and catching fire. It's what gives it a long life cycle. Without a stable supply of cobalt from the DRC, the entire green transition, the whole EV revolution, it just hits a brick wall, full stop.
So what you're saying is we literally cannot build the 21st century energy infrastructure without this one very specific, often very unstable region.
That's the terrifying reality. And it's not just cobalt. The list goes on. South Africa completely dominates the world's supply of platinum group metals. You need those for hydrogen fuel cells, for catalytic converters. Namibia is a giant in uranium for nuclear power. Zambia is absolutely key for high-grade copper. These aren't luxury goods like diamonds or gold for jewelry. These are the nuts and bolts.
It's a different world from oil then, because with oil, if you have a problem in the Strait of Hormuz, you can, ramp up production in Texas or the North Sea or Venezuela. You have options.
You have geographic diversity. With critical minerals, you don't. The supply chain is geographically concentrated to a terrifying degree. It is a series of bottlenecks. And that brings us right back to Musa and his roadblock. You can have the richest cobalt deposit in the world, but you cannot export a single ounce of it if the road to the port is blocked by a militia that's just been radicalized.
So Musa's desire for what he calls the peace of his backyard, that's not some soft, feel-good sentiment. It is hard-nosed economic pragmatism.
It's the single most valuable economic asset in the entire equation. And African leaders know this. You look at something like the African Mining Vision, which is a huge policy framework adopted by the African Union. The entire premise is about creating this stability internally. They don't want to just be a hole in the ground for the rest of the world. They want to move up the value chain.
Meaning they want to process the minerals themselves, build the batteries there, create higher paying jobs.
They want to create value chains, not just extraction chains. But you can't build a $10 billion battery gigafactory if the country is racked by civil war. You just can't attract that kind of capital.
Which makes this ideological instrument that we started with, it makes it so unbelievably destructive. It's not just an idea, it's an anti-development tool.
It actively works against their economic interests and against ours in the long run.
Okay, let's go back to that forum post, to the American rights pivot. We called it the MAGA paradox. Historically, this is an isolationist movement. No more foreign wars, bring the boys home. So walk me through the mechanism. How do you sell intervention in a Nigerian mining region to an isolationist base in Ohio?
You don't sell them a mine. That's the crucial part. If you went to that base and said, hey, we need to send troops to Africa to secure cheap cobalt so General Motors and Tesla can build more EVs, they would laugh you out of the room. They see GM and Tesla as part of the globalist corporate structure they despise.
The lithium argument is a non-starter.
It's worse than a non-starter. It's a political liability. So you have to rebrand the entire conflict. You have to find a different justification, an emotional one, a moral one that's powerful enough to override that deep-seated isolationist instinct.
And for a large and very influential part of the American right, that hook is religion.
It's Christianity. You don't frame the conflict as a complex, multi-generational struggle over land, water, and political power in the Sahel. You frame it as a crusade. You say, they are hunting our Christian brothers and sisters. You post that grainy video of the burning village.
And that language activates a very specific and very motivated part of the political base.
It immediately activates the evangelical wing. But it does more than that.
Yeah.
It creates what you could call a permission structure for the rest of the isolationist base to support intervention. Suddenly sending drones, sending security advisors, maybe even special forces. It's not foreign nation building anymore. That's a dirty word. Now it's protecting the faith. It's a righteous cause.
It's the moral camouflage we talked about.
It's a perfect term for it, because it completely masks the underlying strategic and economic interest. And look, I want to be very clear here. This is not to say that religious persecution doesn't happen. It does, and it's horrific. But when you look at a map of where the political excitement for these missions is most concentrated in Washington, it correlates suspiciously well with the geological maps of where the rare earth elements are.
It's a convenient convergence of interests.
A very convenient convergence.
But the U.S. isn't the only player using these kinds of tactics. It's just using a different narrative. The APRI commentary we looked at details the Russian playbook, the resource for security deals. They're not talking about religion, are they?
No, the Russian model is, in many ways, much more honest in its cynicism. It's purely transactional. They don't need a moral cover story because they aren't trying to convince a Democratic electorate that this is a just cause. They're answering to the Kremlin, not to voters.
And their primary tool is the private military company, the PMC. We all know the name Wagner, but it's really a whole ecosystem of these groups now.
Right. And their pitch to a fragile African government is incredibly simple. It's basically a protection racket on a national scale.
How does it work in practice?
A leader, let's say, feels his grip on power is slipping. Maybe there's a rival faction in the army or a growing insurgency. He can't trust his own military, so he makes a call. The Wagner Group, or its successor, flies in a few hundred instructors. They're not there to train the local army. They're there to be the president's personal Praetorian Guard. They secure the capital, the palace, and most importantly, the key economic assets.
The mine or the oil field.
Exactly. In exchange, the government doesn't pay them in cash, which it often doesn't have. They pay in concessions. Mining rights, a percentage of the gold output, the rights to a timber forest.
So the wealth of the country, the gold or the diamonds, goes straight from the ground onto a Russian plane and out of the country. It never even touches the state treasury.
It completely bypasses the state. And this is disastrous for the country's long-term development. It creates what economists call a classic war economy. The state withers because it has no tax base, and the security of the nation is outsourced to a foreign entity whose entire business model depends on continued instability.
They have a vested interest in the conflict continuing.
Of course they do. If you're a mercenary, peace is bad for business. If the country becomes stable and prosperous, they don't need you anymore. So you have a powerful actor on the ground that is actively working to prevent the very stability that Musa needs to run his mine effectively.
So Musi is completely trapped. He's caught between these two external forces. On one side, you have the Russians and their PMCs, who literally profit from chaos and turn his region into a permanent war economy. And on the other side, you have these Western ideological actors who are turning his workers and neighbors against each other with imported religious conflicts just to score political points back home.
And both of them, from opposite ends of the spectrum, achieve the same result. They destroy the possibility of a boring, functioning state. They undermine the very institutions, the courts, the tax collectors, the civil service, that are necessary for long-term prosperity. You can't build a sustainable economy when the mine is guarded by Russian mercenaries and the workforce has been radicalized by American culture warriors.
It's so clear how we instrumentalize these places. We don't see them as sovereign countries with their own unique, complex problems. We see them as you said, a stage for our own dramas.
A proxy battleground.
And it is crucial to understand that this is not just a right-wing phenomenon. The sources we have and the feedback we get show this very clearly. The American left is doing the exact same thing. The mechanism is identical. They just have a different script.
Oh, without a doubt. The vocabulary changes, but the underlying dynamic of projecting an American domestic political conflict onto another country is precisely the same. This is what a growing number of critics are calling woke diplomacy.
And I have a story that I think captures this side of the coin just as perfectly as Musa's story captured the other. This one is about a woman named Amara. She's an urban planner in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria.
So a completely different world from Musa's mine. This is a highly educated, professional, data-driven person.
Exactly. She lives and breathes spreadsheets. She tracks rainfall patterns. She maps land use permits. She analyzes youth unemployment data. She's trying to find the real empirical reasons why certain districts in the city or certain regions of the country flare up into violence.
She's looking for the root causes in the data.
Right. And she told this story about being invited to a high-level meeting with a group of Western human rights consultants. They flew into Abuja to hold a workshop on the violence happening in Nigeria's Middle Belt.
And this is the region that is often framed in the Western media as the front line of a religious cleansing or a Christian genocide.
That's exactly the frame they came in with. So Amara shows up at this meeting with her laptop full of spreadsheets and charts. She tries to present her data. She has maps showing how a severe 3-year drought has pushed nomadic herders who are predominantly Fulani and Muslim south into the lands of settled farmers, who are predominantly from other ethnic groups and are Christian.
So it's a classic climate-driven resource conflict. The cows need grass and water, the farmers need to protect their crops. It's a Malthusian nightmare.
And it's a solvable one, in theory. A difficult one, but solvable. You're talking about needing better irrigation, new land management policies, designated grazing corridors, economic development for the youth. These are socioeconomic problems.
But that wasn't the story the consultants wanted to hear.
She said she was basically ignored. They nodded politely, but their eyes glazed over when she brought up rainfall data. They weren't interested in the complexity. They needed a simple story of good versus evil, of victims and perpetrators that would fit neatly into the identity-based silos of their home constituency back in the United States.
They needed a narrative that would get clicks, that would drive donations to their NGO, that would look good in their final report to the State Department or whoever was funding them.
They chose the narrative of religious persecution because it's emotionally powerful and politically useful back home. And in doing so, she said, they effectively erased her reality. They erased the lived experience of the people on the ground and the sovereignty of her country to define its own problems.
This is such a massive problem in the world of international development and diplomacy right now. It's this erasure of complexity. When you, as a Western expert, prioritize your prepackaged identity narrative over the hard, messy, socioeconomic facts on the ground, you're not helping. you're actually making things worse.
Amara's takeaway was just chilling. She said watching that meeting made her realize that Western institutional credibility is crumbling. Because if the so-called experts can't look at a drought and see a drought, if they're ideologically programmed to see a hate crime instead, then they've lost the ability to actually solve problems.
Well, let's just dig into that Christian genocide narrative in Nigeria for a second, because it's a perfect example. The sources we've reviewed are very clear on this. The extremist group Boko Haram has actually killed far more Muslims than Christians.
Is that really true? I feel like that's not the story we ever hear.
It's absolutely true, by a significant margin. Their primary targets are anyone who represents the Nigerian state soldiers, police officers, government officials, and any Muslims who don't subscribe to their violent extremist ideology. They bomb mosques, they kidnap Muslim schoolgirls, but that's a complicated story.
It's messy. It doesn't fit a clean narrative.
It's very messy. And if you're a politician in Washington, climate change causing resource competition between herders and farmers is, frankly, a boring story. It doesn't get you on cable news. It doesn't fire up your base.
But religious war, Christians under siege.
That sells. That justifies a budget request. That gets you an applause line at a conference. The fundamental problem is, if your diagnosis of the disease is wrong, your prescription will be poison. If you treat a drought as if it's a jihad, you don't send agronomists and water engineers, you send drone strikes and military aid. And you almost certainly make the underlying problem much, much worse.
Okay, but let's be fair and balanced here. Let's look at the other side of this identity coin. We've got a report here from the Heritage Foundation. Now, we should be clear, this is a conservative American think tank, so their critique is aimed squarely at the current progressive-led State Department. But the specific examples they cite are verifiable.
And this is where we get into the critique of ideological colonialism. The core argument is that the U.S. State Department, under both parties, but perhaps more explicitly now, is using its diplomatic and financial muscle to export America's own internal culture wars.
And the examples are pretty striking. The report mentions the State Department promoting ACE Week, which is Asexuality Awareness Week or International Pronouns Day, in official communications in regions that are struggling with, basic electricity, food security, and violent extremism.
It creates this incredible disconnect, this profound sense of mismatched priorities. Can you imagine you're a local government official in a rural part of, say, Kenya or Botswana? Your biggest worries are malaria, the rising price of grain, maybe an insurgency across the border, and then the delegation from the U.S. Embassy arrives, and their top talking point is about flying a Progress Pride flag from the flagpole.
There was another example in the source about funding for a drag performance.
Yes, a grant was given to fund a series of drag performances in Ecuador. Now, in a Western context, in New York or London, that's seen as a legitimate and important form of cultural expression. But when it's funded by a foreign government and promoted in a traditionally conservative Catholic society, it can be perceived very differently. It reads as a deliberate provocation, an imposition of a very specific set of cultural values.
It feels like the new form of colonialism. People say, you used to send missionaries with Bibles, now you send diplomats with pronouns and gender ideology.
And the backlash to this is very real and very predictable. It alienates traditional societies and it pushes them directly into the arms of our competitors. When a Chinese diplomat shows up in Nairobi, you can be sure they're not saying, we're very concerned about your celebration of ACE Week.
No, they're saying, we don't care about your culture wars. We don't care what your laws are on abortion or sexuality. We just want to trade. We want your copper. And in return, we will build you a port.
It is a devastatingly simple and effective sales pitch if you're an African leader who is tired of being lectured by the West. The Heritage source points out that the U.S. even finds ways to bypass its own laws, like the Helms Amendment, which restricts federal funding for abortion-related activities abroad to push this social agenda. There's a great quote from Kenya's former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, when he was standing next to President Obama. He essentially said, very politely, there are some things that we must admit we don't share. Our culture, our societies don't accept.
So if we pull all this together, if we synthesize this section, Amara, our urban planner with the spreadsheets, she's being ignored by both sides of the American political divide.
It's a pincer movement of ideology.
Yeah.
The American right looks at her complex data on climate and resource conflict and ignores it because it doesn't fit their preferred jihad narrative. And the American left looks at her data on economics and land use and ignores it because it doesn't fit their preferred intersectional equity narrative.
And in both cases, Amara and her country are treated as props. They cease to be a sovereign nation with its own agency and its own complex set of problems. They just become a mirror for whatever political battle America happens to be having with itself that week.
And the direct result of that is a catastrophic loss of Western influence and credibility. African nations are now asking a very simple, very pragmatic question when a Western delegation arrives. Are you here to help us build a road? Or are you here to lecture us on your latest culture war?
And that question brings us perfectly to our third section. To the road. We've talked about the Holy War and the culture war. Now we have to talk about the concrete, the steel, the infrastructure, because this is where the geopolitical rubber really meets the road. I want to introduce you to one last person, Samuel.
Samuel the engineer.
Samuel the engineer. Try to picture this. A small town in a developing region right on the edge of a massive new infrastructure project. In this case, it was a huge hydroelectric dam, a project that was supposed to bring the first consistent, reliable electricity the region had ever seen. A truly life-changing project.
The foundation for any kind of modern economy.
Everything. But Samuel told this story about how, during the construction phase, he watched the local social fabric begin to tear apart. And it wasn't because of the construction work itself, the work was hard, but it was bringing jobs and a sense of purpose. The tearing was because of the ideological exports that were suddenly arriving on everyone's smartphones via satellite internet.
So it wasn't a physical problem, it was a digital one.
Precisely. He saw young men who used to work side by side, who came from different villages but were united by the project, suddenly dividing themselves into hostile camps. They were arguing furiously about polarized frameworks of traditional purity versus liberal corruption frameworks and vocabulary that were imported directly from American social media and cable news.
He called it an ideological solvent. That is such a powerful phrase.
Isn't it? He said it acted faster and was more corrosive than any physical erosion. The communal cohesion, the social trust that you absolutely need to build and maintain a complex piece of infrastructure like a dam was being dissolved and replaced by this vitriol that didn't even originate in their own culture. It was threatening to leave the dam and the entire town's future in ruins before the first turbine could even be turned on.
That image of a solvent, I think that might be the key concept of this whole deep dive. We think of polarization as just, angry people yelling on the internet. But Samuel's story shows that it has a real physical cost. It literally dissolves the glue that holds society and a project together.
Think about what it takes to build a dam. It is an immense feat of social cooperation. It's not just about pouring concrete. You have to resettle villages, which requires intense negotiation and trust. You have to manage water rights for communities both upstream and downstream. You need a workforce from different backgrounds who can collaborate effectively under pressure.
And if that society is suddenly fractured by imported American culture wars, if half the workforce decides the other half is impure or corrupt based on some framework they saw on TikTok, you can't build the dam. The project grinds to a halt.
So exporting our ideology is actively anti-development.
And this is the gaping vulnerability in the Western approach that the Chinese model exploits so brilliantly. We have to talk about the APRI and APR reports on China's infrastructure for resources strategy.
This is the Belt and Road Initiative, but applied specifically to the mineral sector.
Exactly. And the Chinese deal is brutally, beautifully simple. It is purely transactional. A perfect example is the Libido Corridor.
Okay, let's unpack that, because it's a name we hear a lot now in geopolitical circles. What specifically is the Libido Corridor?
It's a railway line. It starts at the port of Libido on the Atlantic coast of Angola. From there, it runs east, all the way across the vastness of Angola into the southern part of the DRC, and connects directly to the copper and cobalt belt in both the DRC and Zambia.
And why is that specific railway line so strategically important?
Because of logistics. Right now, if you dig up a ton of copper concentrate in the DRC, you have a massive problem. You often have to load it onto a truck and drive it thousands of kilometers south to the port of Durban in South Africa or east to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. The roads are terrible, the border crossings are slow and often corrupt, the fuel is expensive. It can take weeks.
It's a logistical nightmare.
A hugely expensive nightmare. The Libido Corridor, a functioning railway to a modern Atlantic port, cuts that journey time and cost drastically. It makes the entire mining operation exponentially more efficient and profitable.
So China comes in and says, we will rebuild this railway for you.
We will rebuild the railway. We will modernize the port of Libido. We will provide the financing and the engineering expertise. And in exchange, we want long-term contracts for the output of the copper and cobalt mines at the end of that line.
And for an African leader, the appeal is the speed and the lack of strings attached.
It's the speed and the silence. That is China's core competitive advantage. The Chinese delegation does not ask about your human rights record. They do not give you a lecture on LGBTQ laws. They do not care about your country's religious affiliations. They just show up and pour the concrete.
And the numbers are stark. The sources say China now controls something like 15 of the 17 industrial-scale cobalt operations in the DRC.
It's total dominance. And they did the same with graphite processing. They now refine nearly 100% of the world's natural graphite, another key battery component. They understood years before the West did that in the 21st century, the power lies not just in owning the resource, but in controlling the infrastructure that gets that resource to market. While the West was busy holding seminars on good governance, China was laying railway track.
But the West is awake now, surely. We're trying to catch up. We hear about the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, and the U.S. has its Mineral Security Partnership.
They are definitely trying to get back in the game. And actually, the U.S. and the EU are now backing the Libido corridor project themselves, trying to outcompete the Chinese financing. But they're consistently hamstrung by their own process, their own ideology.
So what are the strings?
We call them political conditionalities. When a Western development bank or government agency gives you a loan for a mine or a railway, it comes with a mountain of conditions. You have to prove you're meeting incredibly strict environmental standards, labor standards, gender equity quotas in hiring, anti-corruption benchmarks.
Which on paper all sound like good things. We want the projects to be clean and fair.
Of course we do. They are good things. But put yourself in the shoes of a minister of mines in a developing country. You desperately need this road built now. The EU comes and says, we'd love to help. First, please fill out this 500-page environmental and social impact assessment, change these 3 domestic laws, and we can maybe break ground in 3 years. And the next day, the Chinese team comes and says, sign on this line. The bulldozers start on Tuesday. Who are you going to choose?
You choose the concrete.
You almost always choose the concrete. And Samuel's story is the crucial missing piece here. It shows us that the Western approach, which insists on exporting its values alongside its capital, can actually have a destabilizing effect. By exporting our polarization, we make it harder for these countries to build the very cohesive, stable institutions that we claim we want them to have.
This leads to a really interesting concept from one of the sources, the Policy Center for the New South. They talk about the drive for narrative sovereignty. The idea that the global South is no longer a passive object in this great game.
That's the huge shift that's happening right now. For decades, the nations of the global South were characters in a story written in either Washington or Moscow. They're tired of that. They don't want to be the helpless victim in a Western Christian persecution story. And they certainly don't want to be the backward project in a Western woke diplomacy story.
They want to write their own story. They want to be the authors.
Exactly. And they're doing that by building new alliances. They call it South-South cooperation. You see African nations dramatically increasing their trade with India, with Brazil, with Turkey, and most importantly with each other through things like the African Continental Free Trade Area. They are actively looking for partners who will treat them as sovereign equals, or at the very least as pragmatic business partners, rather than as unruly children who need to be constantly lectured.
So in this new multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the only game in town, they have options. They have choices.
They have leverage. And for the first time in a long time, they are starting to use it.
Okay, let's try to land the plane on this. We've covered a lot of ground. It seems like we've identified 3 very distinct playbooks that are competing for influence in Africa right now.
Right, and it's really important to distinguish them clearly. Let's recap. First, you have the Russian playbook. The model is simple. Security for resources. It's violent, it's transactional, it's focused on regime survival. It uses mercenaries to extract raw materials like gold and diamonds, and it actively thrives on chaos.
Playbook number 2.
China. Their model is infrastructure for resources. It's a long-term play. It's about logistics, supply chains, and physical connectivity. It studiously ignores the internal politics and culture of the host country and focuses entirely on building the roads, ports, and railways that lock in their access to critical minerals for decades to come.
And then there's the 3rd playbook, the West, and specifically the United States, and it feels messy.
It's incredibly confused. It's a chaotic mix of everything. On one hand, you have the old impulse for peace brokering and promoting democracy, but that's being constantly undercut by these two warring factions at home. You have the woke diplomacy of the left projecting its culture war, and you have the right-wing religious anxiety of the right projecting its holy war. We are essentially exporting our own national schizophrenia onto the continent.
And the tragic irony is that while we're tied up in knots arguing with ourselves about which American narrative to impose, the concrete is being poured by the people who aren't asking any questions at all.
That is the hard reality of the situation. The physical map of the 21st century is being redrawn while we are fighting with ourselves over the ideological caption.
We in the West so often look at the global South and we ask this question: which side will they choose? Will they choose the East or the West? But after everything we've talked about today, perhaps that's completely the wrong question. As we've seen through the stories of Musa, Amara, and Samuel, the export of Western polarization, doesn't matter if it's the burning cross or the progress flag, it acts as a solvent. It dissolves the very social fabric, the trust and cohesion that a country needs to build a modern economy. Meanwhile, the concrete is being poured, the railways are being built by those who ask no questions at all. And it leaves us with a truly stark realization. The West is currently betting that its values, however conflicted and polarized they may be, are more valuable to Africa than its roads. But in a world that is starving for energy and desperate for stability, we might just wake up one day to find that while we were busy winning the argument, we lost the map.